Hello friends. Tonight's story isn't about curtain calls or encore cheers. It's not about glittering stages or the hum of speakers warming up. It's about something older, wilder, and very, very loud. Before there were arenas, there were valleys. Before there were tickets, there were offerings. And before applause, there was fire. The first concerts in human history were not for entertainment. They were sacred. They were dangerous. They were sometimes deadly. So before we begin, take a breath. Let the quiet settle around you. Dim the lights. Maybe light a candle. Because tonight, we're not going backstage. We're stepping into the dust, the smoke, and the heat. Where music was a language the gods could understand, and silence was unthinkable. Welcome to the forgotten history of the world's first music festivals. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a clearing, just as the sun begins to sink behind the hills. The air is thick with wood smoke and something else. The faint, pulsing rhythm of a drum. Not a clean, modern beat. This one is older, unpolished, unpredictable, almost like it's alive. It thrums through your chest and stirs something deep behind your ribs. This is not a concert, not as we know it. This is a ritual, a gathering, a necessity. Thousands of years ago, long before music was written down or even thought of as art, people gathered in fields, forests, and open plains to make sound together. Not in quiet appreciation, but in relentless, communal release. The drum beat didn't stop, not at midnight, not at dawn. It was rhythm as endurance. And it didn't come alone. There were bone flutes carved from the legs of animals, their notes sharp and reedy. Rattles made from dried gourds, filled with pebbles. Shells used as horns. Voices, hundreds of them, rising in strange looping chants that didn't tell a story but became one. This soundscape could last for days, sometimes longer, because in many early human societies, these gatherings weren't optional. They were survival. Music wasn't entertainment. It was participation in the cosmic order, a way to align with seasons, honor ancestors, or beg for rain. To not join in was to risk standing outside of the tribe's most sacred rhythms, spiritually and socially. And these festivals were rarely gentle. The night could be cold, the fire could be hot. There were no bathrooms, no places to rest in peace. The ground was hard, and the food, if there was any, was simple at best. Mead, if you were lucky. Dried grains and roots if you weren't. The music, intoxicating though it was, could turn overwhelming. Loud, repetitive, and deeply physical, it forced your body into motion. Dancing, often frenzied. Spinning until the dizziness set in. Until the boundary between person and group, human and world, began to blur. And that was the point. These early musical festivals weren't for the listener. They were for the transformation of the self, to bring participants into altered states, to loosen them from their roles and routines, to speak to something older than memory. A modern concert ends with a cab ride home. An ancient music ritual ended, only when the gods were satisfied. Now, imagine staying there, not for a few hours, not even one long night, but for days. The drum never really stops. Maybe it slows. Maybe someone steps away. But someone else always takes over. The rhythm goes on. You try to rest, but the ground is packed. The smoke from the fire clings to your clothes. The air tastes of sweat, bark, and ash. You hear singing, somewhere nearby. A group has started a chant. It doesn't sound like a song. It sounds like something older, winding and low, like wind pushing through trees. You recognize no words, but your body knows the feeling. You rise, not because you want to, but because you feel pulled. Everyone does. This is not a place for spectators. It's a place for surrender. And what if you didn't want to dance? What if your legs were tired? Your stomach sour? Too bad. To sit out might draw attention. At best, curiosity. At worst, suspicion. Because these gatherings had meaning. They weren't for fun. They were for the gods, for ancestors, for harvest, for battle. And to break the rhythm, that was risky. Sometimes it wasn't just music. It was sacrifice. Not always a person. Often an animal, a goat, a bird, a boar. Its blood would be spilled as the drums beat louder, its bones laid near the fire. The smell of roasting flesh would mix with smoke and sweat. No one spoke much during this. They didn't need to. The music filled every space, every silence. Some people cried. Some danced until they collapsed. Some stared into the flames for hours. No one left early. To leave early meant something had gone wrong. That you had broken faith with the tribe, with the gods. So you stayed and danced and waited for dawn. A dawn that might not come quickly. You wake to the sound of more drums. Your body aches. Your throat is dry. There is no tent, no bedroll, only dirt, ash, and the faint warmth of last night's fire. People are already moving. Someone is painting their face with red clay. Another is tying feathers into their hair. A group huddles around a reed pipe, testing its tone. You're still tired, but the music doesn't care. It begins again. A little faster this time. Sharper. Today may be different. Today the music may serve another purpose. Warning, war, or healing. Because ancient music wasn't just celebration. It was instruction. In some places, rhythm was law. Villagers learned when to plant, when to harvest, by song. Children were told stories not in words, but in chant. And sometimes, music was used to punish. A harsh drum beat might follow someone accused of betrayal. A discordant melody might mark grief or exile. Sometimes, musicians were blindfolded, made to play without seeing. Their music, judged by its sound alone. And if the sound was wrong, it depended. Some early societies praised experimentation. Others did not. There are stories, quiet ones, of players silenced, of flutes broken, of hands tied, because music was power. The wrong note wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous. It could stir unrest, awaken spirits, or challenge the wrong chief. So players had to be careful, and the audience careful too. Clap at the wrong moment, dance too soon, stand when you were meant to kneel. You risked more than embarrassment. These festivals held rules, some known, some never spoken aloud. And still, the people came, because when it worked, when the rhythm held, when the fire cracked just right, you could feel the world shift. The air grew warmer, the stars seemed closer, and for a while, no one was alone. Night again. You've lost track of time. There are no clocks here. Only the sun. Only the stars. Only the rhythm. The music hasn't stopped. It's changed, but not stopped. Now it's slower, heavier, like breathing after a long run. The crowd has thinned. Not because people left, but because some now sleep. Where they stood, where they danced. Children curled beside logs. Elders sitting in silence. Eyes closed, listening. There is no applause, no stage, no separation between player and listener. You see someone with a stringed instrument. It has no name, you know. It buzzes low and deep, like bees in a hollow tree. Someone else joins them, a singer. She hums more than sings. Her voice floats above the fire like smoke. You understand none of it, but somehow it still feels familiar. This isn't about performance. It's about remembering, not as an individual, but as a people. A rhythm that connects the living to the dead, the earth to the sky, now to forever. This is why they stayed. Through cold nights and raw feet, through hunger and confusion, through noise that made your bones shake, because the music made meaning. When the world was too vast, music gave it shape. When fear crept in, drums could chase it out. When the harvest failed, songs fed the spirit. You wouldn't last at an ancient festival of music, but they did. And because they did, so much of what came next was possible. The first chords, the first myths, even the first prayers, they all grew out of that drum beat. Now, let that rhythm fade. Let the noise settle, and breathe in the quiet that follows. The music is never really gone, just sleeping. It begins with a sound, light, delicate, like water falling into a silver bowl. A harp, not the kind you imagine from paintings. This one is smaller, carved from dark wood. Its strings made from twisted gut, not metal. Its voice, soft but clear. You are in a palace now, or something like it. A large home of stone or clay, walls thick to keep out sun or storm. The king sits near the center, robed, still, and to his left, the musician, the harpist. He does not speak. His role is not to be seen, but heard. He is here to set the mood, to hold the silence, to play what cannot be said aloud. This is not a performance. This is service. The court musician walks a thin line. He must be close enough to the king to hear every whisper, but never speak out of turn. He must read the room, shift tone when a guest arrives, soften the air when anger rises, play louder when the servants clatter dishes too hard. It is not just skill that keeps him in favor. It is timing, discretion, loyalty. The harpist eats what he's given, sleeps where he's told, never asks to leave. Because this life, though narrow, is safe. Safer than the roads, safer than the fields, safer than war. But safety in a king's court is always temporary. One wrong note, one careless look, one poorly chosen song, and the harpist may vanish, just like that. The harpist is not alone. There are others in the court, scribes, guards, advisors, dancers sometimes, storytellers, priests. But the harpist has a strange place among them. He is not rich, but he eats among the nobles. He is not noble, but he is trusted to calm the king's temper, to ease his sleep, to brighten his waking. And so he is watched, not always directly, but often. Watched by those who envy his place, watched by those who wonder what secrets he hears, watched by those who know how quickly favorites fall. The harpist knows this, so he keeps his eyes low, his voice soft, his music perfect. But no one is perfect forever. One day, the harpist plays a melody that's too familiar. It was his mother's tune, long ago. She sang it while grinding grain in a village now gone. He hums it quietly at first, then plays it soft and slow, just enough to calm the room. But the king stiffens. The king remembers that song too, but not from a mother. He remembers it from a rebellion, from a camp of enemies, from a night of fire and betrayal. The court grows quiet. The harpist realizes too late. He stops, lowers his head, says nothing. And the king says nothing in return. Not then, not that night, not the next, but 3 days later. The harpist's mat is empty. No one saw him leave. No one speaks his name. He is gone, gone, not banished, not buried, just gone. And the court continues, as it always must. New music is played. New servants come and go. But some notice the silence where the harpist once sat. A quiet no song can quite fill. Where did he go? Some whisper that he fled, took his harp and ran under cover of night, to a rival kingdom, to the hills, to the sea. Others say he never left at all, that his body rests beneath the floorboards, buried with his harp, to silence the melody forever. And some, fewer, say the king himself did not wish it, that it was not anger, but fear. The song the harpist played was not just a tune. It was a reminder of the king's past, of things done to rise to power, of blood, and kings, though mighty, fear memory. They surround themselves with beauty, article feasts, laughter, but only so long as it does not point too clearly, too honestly. The harpist may have reminded him too well, too softly, too beautifully. So he was removed, not with rage, but with quiet, the kind of quiet that has no name. And yet, the story did not end there. For in villages far from the palace, a song began to spread, a soft, strange melody, unfamiliar, yet stirring. People hummed it while walking, whistled it in markets, played it on flutes and string shells. It was a song that moved like a shadow, and some said dash dash. It was his. It had no title, no words, just notes, woven like reeds in a riverbank, a melody that came from nowhere and everywhere. Farmers played it on lyres made from oxhorn. Shepherds whistled it to their flocks. Children learned it without knowing where. And always it was played gently, as if it had to be. Software cautious, like a prayer. No one called it the harpist's song. Not aloud, but everyone seemed to know. It wasn't royal music, not grand enough, not boastful. It didn't rise or fall like battle chants. It simply lingered, like a memory. Years passed. The king grew old. His court changed. Harpists came and went. None lasted long. None played that tune. Even long after the king's death, it remained unspoken in palaces. But outside, in fields, in wells, in the way birds sometimes called at dusk, you could hear it still. The harpist's legacy was not power, not wealth, not even fame. It was a melody, a ghost that moved from mouth to mouth, hand to hand, always quiet, always known. Because the first musicians, the real ones, they didn't need their names remembered, only the music. The harpist is gone, but he was never the only one. Court musicians existed across the ancient world, in palaces of Egypt, in the courts of Mesopotamia, on painted floors in Crete, behind lattice screens in China. Some were slaves, some were servants, a few were scholars, but all were expected to perform, not just play. Music wasn't idle, it was function, it had weight. It was how rulers displayed peace or power, how they welcomed guests, how they gave warning. And the musician? He was both ornament and instrument. He dressed well, if modestly, spoke carefully, watched constantly. He might be asked to play during feasts, or in the middle of the night when the queen couldn't sleep, or when a prisoner was brought in for judgment. Imagine that, being told to strum while someone begs for their life, and still your fingers must not tremble, your melody must not falter. This was the work, this was the burden, in return. Sometimes they earned favor, land, coins, even titles, but more often they were forgotten, their songs remembered longer than their names, and maybe that's why some of them disappeared, not through punishment, but by choice. They slipped away, into crowds, into other lives, leaving only notes behind. There were courts that didn't just enjoy music, they believed in it. In ancient Egypt, a skilled musician wasn't merely a performer. He was a medium. The harpist could help the dead remember who they were, could comfort the spirit of a pharaoh journeying through the underworld, could remind the living of their place in the divine order. The instrument itself was sacred, carved from cedar, inlaid with ivory, its form shaped to echo the human body, long neck, rounded belly, fine tension in the strings. To play it was to bring harmony into the world. One wrong note, it could be taken as an omen. And so, a court musician lived in two worlds, one foot in ritual, one in politics. He might play in a temple at sunrise, and then be summoned to soothe a jealous prince before supper. His music needed to calm, to guide, to manipulate when necessary. Some even believed certain modes, specific patterns of notes, could change the weather, hasten birth, prevent illness. It seems distant now, even strange. But to them, it wasn't magical thinking. It was knowledge, hard-earned and inherited. You didn't just learn to play, you learned what music was for. In ancient China, the court musicians studied philosophy, ethics, cosmology. The notes of the zither weren't just notes. They were expressions of balance, duty, season. To play a joyful tune at the wrong moment, disrespectful. To play a mournful one in the presence of new life, unforgivable. So every song had to match its moment, to carry the right weight, and that weight could crush the player if misjudged. Imagine being summoned, not with words, but with a look, a nod from a chamberlain, a silent gesture near the throne. You rise, take your place. You sit with your instrument, the room hushed around you, nobles watching, guards unmoving, the king distracted, or pretending to be. You begin to play, and at that moment, everything matters. The tone, the pace, the silence between your notes. Because sometimes, the music is the message. The king may say nothing, but your song could reply on his behalf. To a foreign envoy, your playing might be light, tentative, polite. To a rival noble, firm, grounded, slightly cold. The wrong choice could mean offense, misunderstanding, or worse, and you would never be told why. You might notice fewer coins in your cup, or find your name left off the list for the next feast, or simply vanish. Some kings liked musicians who entertained, others preferred ones who soothed, and some, they used music to test. A melody might be played in a minor key just to watch how the room shifted, just to see who frowned, who seemed nervous, who knew what the song meant. Because many ancient tunes carried hidden meaning. melodies passed down for generations, each with a story. One song might recall a heroic ancestor, another a failed rebellion, another still a bitter betrayal. Play the wrong one, and you might be seen as stirring old ghosts, calling up things better left forgotten. Even when no words were spoken, a court musician was never truly silent. He was always being read. Not all musicians played in the open. Some were kept behind curtains, heard but never seen. Others stood in alcoves, half in shadow, so as not to distract from the ruler's glory. The music was there to enhance the moment, never to compete with it. And still, their hands moved with care, their breath measured, their focus absolute, because even unseen they were being judged. There were courts where a musician was considered lower than a scribe, but more dangerous. Scribes recorded words, musicians shaped emotion. A song could soften an argument or stir resentment. It could rekindle memory or dull pain. In one Persian court, it was said a single flute player once delayed a war by 3 days. He played for the visiting general at a feast, played so beautifully that the general postponed his invasion just to hear the tune again. That was the rumor, at least. And rumors like that made kings nervous. A musician who could move hearts might also shift loyalties. So their lives were always uncertain. Favored one day, feared the next, protected, then watched, then forgotten. It was a kind of quiet power, but not the kind that lasts. No statues were made, no grand tombs carved, just a scattering of names in half-read scrolls, and music that survived only if others remembered how it went. There comes a moment, always, when the music stops. The harp strings wear down. The player's hands grow stiff. The court changes. The throne is taken by another. And the musician, he's told to rest, or he's simply no longer asked to play. If he's lucky, he's given a small house, a little land, someplace quiet, with no echoes of the court. If he's unlucky, he is sent away without word, replaced by someone younger, bolder, more fashionable. But sometimes the end isn't sharp. It's soft. He begins to forget the songs, not all at once. Just a note here, a measure there. He hums to himself while stirring his soup, and pauses, trying to remember the line that once pleased a queen, or calmed a furious prince. He cannot. It slips away, and in time, so does he. No grand farewell, no public mourning, only silence where there was once music. And yet, in the years that follow, a child plays something strange by a stream. A melody no one taught her. Familiar, but distant. She doesn't know its name. Doesn't know it came from a palace, from trembling fingers, from a vanished man in a dangerous room. But she hums it anyway. And in that moment, the harpist plays again. The wind moves gently across the desert. It leaves no trace, no sound. Just a long hush that stretches into the horizon. But beneath the sand, far beneath, the music waits. It has waited for centuries, maybe longer, until one day a team of archaeologists uncovers something strange. Not bones, not jewels, not weapons, a flute, delicate, cracked with age, carved from the thigh bone of a bird, its surface smoothed by hands long gone. They find it in a burial, a small one, no gold, no crown, but the body is carefully placed, curled gently on its side, wrapped in linen, and beside it, the flute. It is not a war prize. not a ceremonial scepter. It is something personal, a voice the dead once carried. And now it lies still. The desert has kept it safe. Sand, heat, and time have done their work. No one has played it for 3,000 years. Not until now. The flute is fragile. It cannot be rushed. First, it must be cleaned. Slowly, gently, grain by grain. The archaeologists don't even know, at first, that it's an instrument. It looks like bone. Just bone. But someone notices the holes. Evenly spaced. Smoothed at the edges. Too precise for chance. Too human to be natural. They compare it to others. A handful of similar finds. In caves, in tombs, in dry cliffside burials. And gradually, a pattern forms. These weren't tools. They were made to sing. And so the question rises, softly, cautiously. Can we hear it? It's not a matter of breath. The flute cannot be blown like modern instruments. Too brittle, too worn. But someone, a music archaeologist, builds a copy. Same dimensions, same shape, same scale. And then, in a quiet lab, under low light, they play. It's not beautiful, not in the way we expect. It's high, thin, a little wild, like wind slipping through a reed hut. But it's unmistakably music, a human sound, ancient and strange, echoing across 3,000 years. And in that moment, something happens. For a brief second, the silence of the grave is broken, and a life once forgotten breathes again. The instruments they made were never mass-produced. Each one was its own story, its own set of hands, its own moment in time. They weren't made quickly, and they weren't made for profit. Imagine a man in the late Bronze Age, sitting in a shaded shelter of reeds. He holds a bone in his lap, not just any bone, but one chosen carefully. Long, hollow, uncracked by weather or animal teeth. Maybe it's the leg of a crane, or a young gazelle. He scrapes it gently, smooths it with a stone, rubbing until the surface no longer catches on his thumb. Then, with a flint tool, he begins to drill. There is no ruler, no guide, only instinct and memory. He knows where to place the holes because he was taught by someone older, who was also taught. It's a lineage not of blood, but of sound. Each hole must be just so. Too close together, and the tones muddle. Too far apart, and the breath cannot reach them. And once it's done, he tests it, not with a performance, just a few breaths, listening not only for pitch, but for how it feels. If it sings dash dash, he smiles. If it does not, he begins again. We often imagine ancient people as crude, hurried, struggling simply to live. But the care put into these instruments tells a different story. A story of patience, of detail, of artistry. They didn't need music to survive. They needed it to be human. And that need shaped their tools. Some instruments were made from reeds tied with sinew. Others used tortoise shells stretched with hide. Wood was hollowed out, filled with pebbles, sealed and shaken. Each material had its own voice, its own weight, its own ritual. To make music was to shape nature into meaning. And in some graves, we find these instruments nestled beside the body, as if they too would continue playing in the afterlife. The desert is not silent. It whispers, it sighs. It carries sound across impossible distances. A single drum beat can travel far in the dry air. A flute's call, barely a breath, may echo off stone walls and return like a memory. That's why deserts kept their music. Not in notes, not in writing, but in the sand, in the graves, in the things people chose to bury. Across North Africa and into the Arabian Peninsula, archaeologists have uncovered instruments in tombs that once faced the rising sun. Graves carved into stone, shelters of woven grass, and within them, sound sealed in silence. One burial site in present-day Sudan revealed a curved horn carved from antelope, not ornamental. Its mouthpiece was worn, used. Beside it, small clay bells, and fragments of a framed drum, a stretched animal hide, now brittle as paper. The person buried there wasn't a warrior, no sword, no shield, but the care taken in arranging these instruments suggests importance. Perhaps a ritual leader, perhaps a storyteller, maybe someone whose role was to bring the community into rhythm, with each other, with the earth, with the unseen. And this isn't unique. From Central Asia to the highlands of Peru, deserts and dry valleys preserve these fragments of music. In places where the living struggled to endure, the dead protected their sounds. Even in death, it seems people clung to music. They placed flutes near the head, rattles near the hands, drums beside the feet, not as decoration, but as tools for whatever came next. Music was more than memory. It was preparation. Because if the afterlife had ears, surely it also had rhythm. In many ancient societies, music wasn't just for celebration. It was a bridge, a way to speak to what could not be seen, to guide spirits, to soothe ancestors, to keep dangerous forces away. The instruments found in graves weren't leftovers. They were offerings, carefully chosen, carefully placed. Some were broken deliberately before burial. A cracked drum, a snapped flute, strings unstrung, not from damage, but from ritual. It was believed that by killing the instrument, it could be reborn in the spirit world. The music would go on, just elsewhere. And this wasn't just in one place. In South America, near the Atacama Desert, graves contain panpipes made from bird bones. They're small, simple, but smoothed by years of use. They were held often, played often. In ancient Iran, a set of twin flutes was buried alongside a woman with painted hands. Her nails dyed red with mineral powder. Perhaps a priestess, perhaps a healer. The flutes were placed near her head, like twin ears, waiting for the wind. And in Mongolia's high steppes, frame drums are found beneath burial mounds. Flat, round, once stretched with hide, now silent. The people who placed these instruments in the earth didn't do so casually. They believed the dead had journeys to make, and sound was part of the map, just as a drumbeat can guide dancers in life. It could guide the soul after death. The rhythm didn't end. It only changed direction. And somewhere, in that vast silence between breath and sand, the music kept walking. Sometimes the music comes back, not in full, not the way it was, but in fragments, in echoes. A shepherd in the hills plays a tune on a reed pipe. He doesn't know it, but it carries the same shape, the same rhythm, as one found carved into bone in a grave 2,000 years ago. A woman hums as she grinds grain. Her melody floats out the window across the fields. It holds no name, no lyrics, but it stirs something in an old man nearby. He's heard it before, long ago. Some sounds never vanish. They just go quiet for a while. The instruments we find in graves weren't meant to be sealed away. They were meant to travel. And sometimes they do. Scholars and craftspeople today rebuild these instruments. Painstakingly, respectfully, they cut wood by hand, sew gut strings, carve finger holes with obsidian tools, just like the old ones. They copy every detail, not just to replicate the look, but to feel the sound. And when they play them, the past answers, not in full symphonies, but in single notes, in tones that vibrate against the skin, sometimes harsh, sometimes soft, but always alive. It's not nostalgia, it's connection. These are not dead things, they are paused, and when they are played again, even for a moment, they wake. The desert gives them back, not as treasure, not as secrets, but as sound. For every instrument found, there are thousands lost. In wood turned to ash, in reeds long decayed, in graves no longer marked. But even when the object is gone, the idea remains. Archaeologists have found impressions, shadows of drums pressed into ancient clay, the woven patterns of rattles, the ghost shape of a harp carved into the side of a tomb wall. In one site, all that's left is a row of small rounded stones. They sit in a semicircle, carefully arranged, too even to be natural. Beside them, faint scuff marks on the floor. Barefoot. Someone danced here. Long ago. There's no music now, no flute, no drum. But somehow, you can still hear it. The rhythm remains in the dust. These traces are more than archaeology. They are memory, left in physical form. Even the instruments that never reached a grave. The ones broken during life, discarded, used until they snapped. They left a mark, in wear patterns on cave walls, in grooves cut into stone from strings pulled too tight, in soot from fires lit during ceremony. Music lived with people. It wasn't separate. It marked the seasons. It measured time. It helped them weep, celebrate, remember, belong. And when it was no longer needed, or when its purpose had been fulfilled, it returned to the earth, just like everything else. But the earth never forgets. And every so often, it lets us find what it held: a flute, a drum, a string. And in finding it, we remember how to listen. Not every instrument makes sense to us. Some are easy to identify. Flutes, drums, harps. We know what they are. We know how they work. But others are mysteries. In some graves, archaeologists have found strange objects. A hollowed-out gourd with teeth embedded along the sides. A curved wooden frame strung with chords that don't resonate. A flat disc made of stone, with symmetrical cuts and a polished center. They're not tools. They're not weapons. And yet, they show signs of careful use. Marks where fingers once pressed. Edges worn smooth by years of handling. Even, in one case, the faint stain of pigment. Red ochre brushed on in curved patterns. These objects don't play the way modern instruments do. They don't hum or sing or vibrate in familiar ways. But that doesn't mean they were silent. Some may have been shaken. Others struck lightly with a stick or bone. Still others might have relied on wind or breath or flame. And then there are those that may not have made sound at all. Silent instruments. Objects meant to be held during music, to focus the mind, to direct the breath, to join in the ritual, not with noise, but with presence. We often assume that music is always about sound, but in many early cultures, it was just as much about rhythm, movement, intention. A carved object might be passed hand to hand, as a chant echoed in the background, its journey through the group forming its own silent tempo. Or it might be buried after a single use, a moment of music too sacred to repeat. These objects challenge us because we want explanations, we want categories, strings, wind's percussion. But ancient music wasn't always concerned with such rules. It wasn't always about performance or even communication. Sometimes it was about change, transformation, connection, crossing thresholds. From life to death, from one season to the next, from one identity to another. And in those moments, an object didn't need to sound. It needed to mean. So we catalogue these strange artifacts. We label them. We draw them in neat diagrams. But part of their power is that they resist us. They don't fit neatly into our shelves. They don't explain themselves. They sit in museum drawers, quietly waiting, like a forgotten note at the end of a page. And maybe that's enough. Maybe their silence is what we're meant to hear. It wasn't all flutes and drums. Some instruments weren't meant to be held. They were meant to rise, suspended from beams, hung in trees, placed on rooftops or high poles to catch the wind and the stars. These were wind harps, bark whistles, shell chimes, instruments that required no hands, only air, only time. In ancient Anatolia, archaeologists uncovered small ceramic discs with holes carefully placed around the edges. Not quite bells, not quite whistles. They don't chime when struck. They hum softly when air moves through them. They were likely tied in rows high above the village so that breezes could pass through them. Their sound wasn't loud, not something to dance to, not even something everyone heard clearly. But for those nearby, in the stillness before dawn or the long hush of evening, the tones would rise and fall like birdsong in a dream. There's a theory that these instruments were not for people at all, that they were meant for the sky. Offerings to unseen forces, reminders that the village below still listened, still remembered, still reached upward. The people who made them often lived hard lives, their homes of mud brick or woven reeds, their hands thick with callus, their nights uncertain. And yet, they hung music from their rooftops, because even in hardship, beauty was necessary. Not as luxury, as survival. To lift something into the wind, to let it sing without control, without ownership, was an act of trust. Trust that the gods might hear, that the ancestors might listen, that the sky itself might answer. Some of these artifacts show repairs, tiny clay plugs where cracks once appeared, evidence that someone, long ago, cared enough to fix them, to bring them back to life. Others were buried in layers of ash, not from destruction, but from ritual burning. Each piece carefully wrapped, ceremonially retired, because their sound had served its time, its season. And now, something else would begin. We think of graves as endings, but these objects suggest otherwise. They suggest music wasn't just part of life. It was how people moved between worlds, from the earth to the sky, from the body to the spirit, from sound to silence. And then, if the wind is kind, from silence, back to sound again. And now, we return to the silence. Not the silence of nothing, but the silence after a song ends, when the final note still lingers in the mind, when the hands are still, the breath steady. Across deserts, valleys, highlands and plains, we've found their instruments, but rarely their names. These early musicians left no autographs, no records of their fame, no carved dedications on their flutes or harps. Only wear, only care, only signs of touch, which might be more honest than fame. Because what they left us isn't performance. It's presence. A shell worn smooth from fingers. A drum still taught across centuries. A pipe made from the wing bone of a crane. Beautiful, delicate, and deliberate. These things don't just tell us what music sounded like. They tell us what it meant, that it was worth carrying, worth crafting, worth laying beside the dead, that it accompanied birth, grief, rain, darkness, hope, and that it helped people become themselves. A child singing as she weaves, an old man tapping a rhythm on a clay pot, a woman playing a string shell by firelight as shadows flicker and stretch. They weren't making music to be remembered. They were making music because they were alive. And when they were no longer alive, they trusted the music to go on. Even now, archaeologists open tombs and find more than bones. They find echo. They find a reed with holes cut just so, a set of stones that ring in harmony when struck, a bowl whose edge carries the wear of 1,000 thumbs. And with every discovery, a question rises. What did it sound like? Sometimes we can guess. Sometimes we recreate it. Sometimes we simply close our eyes and listen. Not for accuracy, but for connection. Because if someone, 3,000 years ago, made a flute from a bird's wing and played it under the stars, that tells us something vital. They were not so different from us. They too needed something to fill the silence, to mark a moment, to soften pain, to shape joy. They did it without notation, without recordings, without concerts, but they did it. And some part of it, however faint, still rings. So let the wind blow, let the sand shift, let the graves sleep. The music hasn't ended. It's just playing very, very softly. Imagine a vast hall, not a concert hall, but a throne room. Marble floors, polished walls, curtains drawn to soften the light. The people are gathered, not just nobles, but servants, advisors, messengers, guests from far away. And then music. Not loud, not jubilant, software controlled, measured. This is not entertainment. This is strategy. Because in courts from Babylon to Versailles, music wasn't a distraction. It was a message. In ancient Mesopotamia, musicians were employed directly by kings. Their duties were not just to amuse, but to maintain atmosphere, to regulate behavior. A tense meeting. A low-stringed hum might keep tempers down. A formal ceremony. A steady beat could pace the procession. Music set the tone. It told people when to speak, when to bow, when to wait. And it wasn't just for court life. Festivals, parades, religious rites, all carefully choreographed, and always in the background, sound. In Babylon, large drums signaled transitions, not just between songs, but between parts of the ceremony. When to kneel, when to rise. In Egypt, temple musicians performed during offerings, not to please the gods, but to remind the people who held the divine connection. The pharaoh, the priests. Music helped reinforce the structure, the order, the idea that harmony was only possible through obedience. Even silence was musical. In some courts, when the ruler entered, instruments fell silent, a powerful gesture, sound itself submitting to presence. In this way, nobles didn't just enjoy music, they used it to calm, to awe, to rule. Now, Let's walk through the halls of Versailles. It is morning. A line of nobles waits outside the king's chambers, not to speak, just to watch him wake. This ritual, called the lever, is performed every day, a ballet of politeness, of rank, of proximity to power. And through it all, music. A violinist waits by the door. A small ensemble prepares in a nearby room. When the king rises, they play. Not something grand, something delicate, refined. It is not for the king's enjoyment alone. It is for the room. The music signals the moment. It sets the tone. It reminds everyone that this is not chaos. This is order. At Versailles, every part of daily life was a performance. The gardens, the meals, even the king's walk down the corridor. And music. Music was the cue. It was timed, placed, matched to the movement of people. When the king ate, musicians played from a hidden gallery. They couldn't be seen, only heard. They played soft, slow pieces to slow the king's eating, to shape the pace of the meal. When ambassadors visited, the music changed. It was chosen to impress, to elevate the moment, to remind visitors that they were standing not before a man, but before the sun. Louis XIV understood the power of music. He had his own court composers. He created state ballets. He danced in them himself. Each performance reinforced a message. This is who holds the rhythm. This is who leads the dance. And the nobles, the crowd, the kingdom, they followed, because to move out of step was to fall from favor. In every great kingdom, there comes a moment when the ruler needs more than swords. He needs loyalty. He needs calm. He needs belief. And for that, he needs music. Across time, kings and queens have used music to create spectacle. Not just beauty, order. In ancient China, imperial processions were led by music. Drums, flutes, bells, cymbals. Each instrument chosen for its sound and its symbolism. These weren't musicians standing on a stage. They were walking banners. Audible proof of power. The same was true in Rome. Emperors held triumphs. Massive parades celebrating military victories. The soldiers marched in formation. Behind them, captured goods, captured people, and always trumpets. Not the kind we know, but long, curved horns, bronze and loud. They cut through the noise of the crowd. They told the people, pay attention. This moment matters. It wasn't just about hearing the victory. It was about feeling it. The horns vibrated through the air, through stone walls, through bodies. You couldn't ignore them. That was the point. And in the Middle Ages, cathedral bells played a similar role. They didn't just call people to prayer. They told time. They reminded people when to stop, when to start, when to listen. In towns across Europe, rulers paid musicians not just to play, but to walk the streets. Town pipers, minstrels, guardians of sound. Their presence meant stability. Their music said things are in order. All is well, even when it wasn't. Because music, in the hands of the powerful, didn't need to tell the truth. It needed to tell the story. And so we return to the throne room, to the palace, to the square where the crowd waits, to the quiet before the trumpet. Because music didn't just entertain, it instructed. In the courts of Europe, etiquette was taught through sound. A certain tune meant approach. Another meant bow. Still another, wait. Pages were trained to recognize these cues. So were guests, even servants. Everyone in their own way danced. And when revolt threatened, when the people grew restless, music was often the first to change. It became louder, more patriotic, filled with drums and brass, not to reflect reality, but to shape it. Even in more recent centuries, military marches were designed for unity, for pace, for morale. A beat that soldiers could walk to, that crowds could cheer to, that enemies could hear from far away. Sound as warning, sound as claim. In Versailles, in Babylon, in every empire where rulers sought control, music was the softest weapon and one of the most lasting. Because long after the crown has fallen, the walls crumbled, the banners faded, the music lingers, not in its original form, but in echoes, in rhythms that still shape how we gather, how we wait, how we know when something important has begun. It tells us, now is the time, now is the moment, now, listen. And in that moment, we follow, whether we mean to or not. That is the quiet legacy of noble music. And now the stage is empty. The fire has gone out. The harp lies still. The flute is quiet in its grave. But if you listen, really listen, you might still hear something. Not sound exactly, not song, but a presence, a rhythm beneath your breath, a memory that isn't quite your own. We've traveled through time tonight, from the raw, pulsing festivals of ancient villages to the shadowed courts where a single wrong note could mean exile. We followed music into the sand, into graves where silence became sacred. And finally, we stood in the echoing halls of power, where rulers shaped obedience not just with law, but with melody. What do we take from all of this? That music was never just background. It was meaning. It was movement. It was memory. And above all, it was human. Even when no one applauded, even when no one remembered the names, the music remained. So as you drift off now, know that the story isn't over. Somewhere, an old tune is still being hummed. A bone flute waits in the dust. A child taps a stone in time with their own small heartbeat. The concert never truly ends. It only changes form.